What is up guys, Blue here. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know for these midweek compilations coming out going into the future, what I'm going to be putting in these are re-recordings of my oldest stories, so the ones I did like 7 years ago or whatever. I decided to just basically put all of those I'm going to do into this big compilation instead of doing regular videos with those remasters. Just so if you feel like you want to listen to them, then you can, and if you don't, you can just watch the regular videos and ignore this one. All the ads will be in the beginning like usual for the long videos, and the screen will be black as well for anyone who wants to listen to it and fall asleep while they do so. I'll also probably include some types of ghost stories and other submissions I get that don't really fit well with the main videos that I can record in these ones. So, I hope you guys enjoy, and without any further ado, I'll let you get straight into the stories. So I figured I would share and see what you all thought of my hospital roommate. For a little bit of background, when I was 15 or so, I was put in short-term psychiatric inpatient at the hospital in my town. It was because I had tried to kill myself, followed by a small breakdown in partial inpatient, which is basically inpatient where you go home to sleep. After my breakdown and partial, they put me to full inpatient. It was during this time that my diagnosis was switched from depression to bipolar, and I haven't been back since. I definitely was very unstable at the time though, so this all really freaked me out that much more. The way the bedrooms were laid out, there would be 2 bedrooms with separate entrances connected to a small foyer, with an open doorway to the main hall. No one was allowed into your private bedroom space except yourself, and only the 2 people in the bedrooms connected to it were allowed in the foyer. For my 3 days there, I had this really nice roommate named Amber. Amber and I would just sit in the foyer and talk to each other, mostly about the things we were dealing with at the time. Well, on my 3rd day, Amber was sent home. I was really bummed because as a result I had no one who I could share things or my space with. I spent my entire 3rd night alone. On the evening of my 4th day there, a new girl came to inpatient, a girl named Jade. Being a girl, she was placed in my room block, rather than the other empty space where her roommate would have been a guy. The ward was co-ed, but the room blocks were gender-specific. She was 14, so a year younger than I was, and appeared to be Filipino in ethnicity. She had this long, extremely dark hair that went halfway down her back and seemed very quiet. I was very polite to her, mainly because I was happy to not be there alone anymore. She didn't really talk a whole lot for the first hour or so that she was there, but when we went to our block pre-bedtime, about a half hour to just sit and talk in our foyers before bed, she explained to me why she was there. You see, the thing about her was that she seemed really normal, until she actually started talking. The very second she did, I immediately got this creeping feeling along my skin. It's not what she was saying that was weird. It was the way that she was saying it. There was this weird edge to her voice that wasn't quite right, and made her seem almost unresponsive to the things she was saying. Her mannerisms were also slightly forced, like she was a puppet or something. She went on to tell me she and her friends had gotten really drunk, and while running around doing drunk people things, she'd been caught and put here against her will. Now, that in and of itself really didn't make any sense. I mean, you don't get put in the psych ward for getting drunk with your friends. A lot of people had bogus stories though about how they'd gotten placed there, so I shrugged it off as her just not wanting to share. She was very quiet most of the following day. That evening, when TV time was about to start, Jade and I were sitting in the TV room with a 3rd girl from inpatient named Ruby. You see, Ruby and I actually ended up friends in the outside world, after coincidentally seeing each other again over a year after inpatient. The 3 of us were alone in the room, because the staff had walked out for just a minute to talk to the desk person outside. She was still within our view, but more than likely could not hear what was going on. Ruby, Jade, and I were just sitting there on the couch. I was in the middle with Ruby to my right and Jade to my left. Ruby and I were talking about our cats on the outside, both missing our pets. It was common for the teens and inpatient to talk about the things they loved the most on the outside. Jade wasn't participating really, but she suddenly piped up saying how much she hated cats. She went on to tell a story about how a stray had once scratched her, so she killed it and chopped it up into little pieces, then threw the bits out into the woods. If that story wasn't creepy enough on its own, recall how I described her demeanor. She said all this as if she was ordering a cup of coffee or casually talking about the weather. It was horrifying. Ruby and I exchanged a brief look, and one of us asked about whether that was the first time she'd ever killed something. She responded that it was not. She killed small animals all the time, and even tried to hurt other children as well, because she hated them. Because that's a healthy and constructive way to deal with something you hate, right? Within the next minute, the staff person came back into the room. Ruby and I were still relatively floored by this incident. The staff member was unaware of what had been said, and we were too scared to mention it. Fortunately, I left the hospital 3 days later. I haven't seen Jade ever since, but sometimes I can't help but wonder if she's out there killing people or something. I like to pretend she was just screwing with us in some sort of sick, demented way. At least then, she would just be a fucked up girl with a fucked up sense of humor, rather than a psycho killer. But honestly, I'm not sure. So to give you a bit of backstory, a few years ago I started to suffer with a lot of stomach problems. Fast forward about 4 years, and turns out I got a real bad stomach ulcer. Not ideal. Anyway, last summer I had to spend a night in the hospital running some tests on it, and the main hospital was not in my town. My boyfriend offered to drive me up there. We got there quite late, probably around 9 p.m. or so. When I arrived there, they mentioned my boyfriend could not stay with me. I didn't like the idea of staying there alone, mainly because I hated hospitals. He offered to at least stay with me until they kicked him out. We fell asleep and got woken up at around 6 a.m. by one of the nurses, explaining that they'd forgotten to ask my partner to leave, and even though she didn't particularly mind, the head nurse would be on her way shortly to do her morning rounds. I really shouldn't have a visitor in my room, and we might both get in trouble if he stayed. My boyfriend offered to go down to the car for a few hours to sleep more, and once they'd finished up the tests, they'd let me go. Anyway, this is where it got weird. About 5 minutes into my boyfriend leaving, this random guy walked into my room and sat down, telling me the nurses had asked him to come in here. I know this sounds stupid, but I guess I was in shock for a few minutes because at first I sort of believed him. I started probing him, and they told me he was asked to sit in here and watch me. By now, my fight or flight was starting to kick in. Sort of, at least. I ran into the bathroom with my phone. Don't ask why I didn't run into the corridor. Again, I clearly don't cope well with stressful situations. I get in the bathroom and call my boyfriend, who was crazy protective of me, and told him what was happening. He immediately made his way back from the car. At this same moment, from the bathroom, I could hear the guy now screaming, "What's this girl's name? What age is she?" I didn't know who he was shouting to, because there was no one there to answer him. Thankfully, I could hear my boyfriend coming back into the room and asking this man who he was. This must have really startled him, because he took off running down the hall. When I came out of the bathroom, I noticed my boyfriend had a terrified look on his face. I guess I should have mentioned that I wear contacts but had taken them out before falling asleep, so I wasn't seeing my best at the moment. Between not having full sight and my panic, I'd missed that the man's hands, feet, and clothes were covered in blood. He left this gigantic trail across the floor, across the wall, onto the chair he was sat on even. At this point, I went down to the nurse's station, still a little bit in shock and explaining what had happened. Right away, someone came up to clean the mess, but again they asked my boyfriend to leave, something we were clearly not happy about in this moment. The nurses were clearly trying to keep me calm as they tried to make light of it, but I knew something was not right. At this point, I realized the guy was actually keeping a close eye on my room, because no sooner than my boyfriend had left, the man walked right back in, closed the door, and began walking towards me as I was on the bed. Thankfully, the nurse was present this time and demanded this man leave. I don't think they'd really taken me seriously until now, but finally they noticed that having a bloodied man continuously trying to break into my room was really shaking me. They told me it was safer to have my boyfriend with me now, as he must have been that guy's biggest deterrent. Rightly so, I guess, because for the entire rest of the time I was there, this guy would keep walking past my room, trying to peer through to see if my partner was still there. Eventually, I guess he gave up or was sent somewhere else. I finally finished my tests and was allowed to go home. The nurses tried to tell me that this guy had a head injury, which was the reason he was in the hospital, but they were obviously worried enough for my safety to let me break the rules and have my boyfriend stay in the room. Anyway, what really worries me the most is that this guy was definitely watching my room, because every time my boyfriend left, he came in right away. It doesn't even bear thinking about what would have happened if the nurses had kicked him out in the middle of the night instead. I was in the hospital for about 10 days suffering from a kidney infection. My mother visited me, but the rest of my family was too busy to do so. Honestly, I was pretty lonely and in a bunch of pain as well. I used to keep in touch with my friends and family by my mobile phone. There was this young male doctor student who was very chatty and friendly with all the patients. I can't quite remember his name, so I'm going to call him Edward. Whilst attending the ward, Edward used to chat me up quite a lot. He was very intelligent and nice and seemed a decent chap. He even gave me a get-well-soon card to cheer me up. The other female patient teased Edward and said he should ask me out. I made it very clear though to Edward that I did not fancy him at all. I told him instead he was like a brother to me. Edward just laughed at what the ladies had said. He assured me he didn't fancy me either, and said that a patient-doctor relationship was very unethical anyway. After 10 days, I felt a lot better. The doctors discharged me. I said my goodbyes to the other patients and to Edward, and wished him well in his studies and career. I called a taxi to take me home at this point. I'd put my mobile phone on silent. When I reached home, I checked it, and found I'd had 8 missed calls from a number I did not recognize. I was puzzled, but I didn't really think too much of it. I thought I'd just ring the number the next day and find out what was going on. I had my shower and went to bed. The next morning, though, I checked my phone, only to realize that I'd forgotten to put the ringer back on. I'd seen that I had another 10 missed calls during that night. I called this number, and a man answered the phone. To my surprise, it was Edward. I was extremely annoyed and asked Edward how he'd even gotten my number. He told me I'd given it to him, but I assured him that I had never done so. He insisted so much that I honestly started to even doubt myself. After all, I was in the hospital in a lot of pain and doped up with morphine most of that time. Anyway, Edward and I chatted for a small amount of time before I hung up. He called me again a few days later. I was recuperating at home. He would call me every few days from then on. One day, I told Edward I could not talk, as I was still not well. I really needed to go food shopping before the shops closed, too. Edward offered to shop for me and bring the food over to my place, which I politely declined. After that incident, Edward started calling me every day. I often didn't even take his calls at this point. He texted me, saying he needed to talk as his mother was ill. I answered his call because of that. Then he told me he had only said that because he wanted me to answer the phone. He said he knew I had another appointment in a few days' time, and he would meet me there. He told me he had a new mobile phone for me, and would put me on his family plan as well. I asked him how he even knew I had an appointment, and he told me he'd accessed my medical records. I did not attend that particular appointment because I really did not want to see Edward now. I told him I didn't want any more contact with him at all and to leave me alone. Edward told me he was in love with me and wanted to marry me. He kept on calling and calling, and I did not take any of his calls. In one day, I'd have maybe 40 missed calls and 60 text messages from him. He would even call me in the middle of the night at like 3 a.m. Needless to say, I was very creeped out and beginning to get somewhat scared. One day, I had a call from a new unknown number. It was Edward. He was now changing his number, so I'd pick it up thinking it was someone else. Really scared now. I told the police, but they said there was nothing they could do, as he was not really threatening me. And Edward kept on changing his number, using pay-as-you-go phone chips. It was hard to prove it was actually him calling. At this point, I felt Edward was one of those people that could possibly get nasty and dangerous. I was particularly scared, as my mom pointed out to me that he could easily find out where I live by just checking my medical records. At this point, I asked a good male friend of mine to answer Edward's phone call to me and pretend he was my new boyfriend. Well, that didn't work. Edward refused to believe I had a boyfriend. I was at my wit's end at this point. I wasn't eating or sleeping. I was terrified. I had friends stay over with me all the time, and I made sure I was never alone. One morning, I just sort of woke up, and instead of fear, I was extremely angry. How dare that stupid little coward bully me and take over and ruin my life? I telephoned Edward instead. I was very firm. I told him if he ever contacted me again, I would report him to the dean of his university. I would send the dean everything he'd ever written me, and his career as a doctor would be over. From that day forth, he never did contact me again. I really wish I'd thought of that sooner. I was just so relieved, though, that I could finally lead a normal life again. Okay, so a little bit of backstory before I tell you one of the craziest experiences of mine that happened during my 2-year security career from 2013 to 2015. I'm a 6'7" male in Australia. I'd like to think I'm fairly tough and an intimidating guy, but some of that shit that used to go on at the mall, I used to work the night shift, and it still gives me goosebumps to this day. The mall I worked at was very, very large, probably the biggest in my state even, I'd say. All the way up to about 8:30, it would be extremely busy. Only around 9:30 would we manage to usher out all of the stragglers, and only at about 11 would all of the business owners had left. My job was basically to patrol the mall and make sure no one was sticking around after the doors were closed during the night. We didn't get guns or batons, only a small can of mace that was very rarely used. There were multiple occasions where we would find would-be thieves hiding around, trying to break into shops after dark, but they were normally far outnumbered by the 4 or 5 of us on shift at a time, and they would usually be intimidated by me or some of the more imposing members of security. This one night, though, shit started getting really weird for me on the night shift. I'd say it was about 2 o'clock or so, and I was standing in the middle of the empty food court just eating a sandwich. This was the only part of the mall that had any light at nighttime due to the skylight, so it was the most comfortable place to eat lunch. While I was eating, though, I heard this dull scraping noise from the hallway leading off from the food courts and to some toilets. It sounded like a piece of metal being dragged across the floor or something. I was immediately put on edge and flicked my torchlight over there without a moment of hesitation. I remember creeping down that hallway, flashlight in hand, illuminating a good 6 or 7 meters in front of me. As I got closer to the end of the hall, the noise became louder and louder until I was at the very end of the hallway. There was the toilet doors to the left and right of me. I could tell the sound was coming from the female toilets. I gripped the handle and opened the door a tiny crack. The noise was now very clear and had me not scared but instead confused. I called out, "Hey, who's in there?" The noise immediately stopped. I paused for a moment, listening hard through the tiny crack of the door, and I swear to God I could hear breathing, a low male breathing. I shut the door, still gripping the handle tight, and flicked on my radio. "This is 1-3. I need help in the food court bathrooms. I think someone's hiding in there." No response. Now this was really strange. It put me even farther on edge. Policy was to always answer the radio. Now I was truly becoming quite alarmed. "This is 1-3. Does anyone copy?" Still no response. I remember whispering to myself, "What the fuck is going on here?" I again opened the door just a tiny crack. "Listen, mate," I said, sounding as intimidating as possible. "If you don't fucking come out here with your hands up right now, you're gonna end up eating your own teeth tonight. Do you want that?" I sat there at the door, quite honestly terrified at this point, but there was no response. In fact, now there was no noise at all. I yelled out into the bathroom. "Okay, I'm coming in now. If you do anything stupid, it's not my fault if you'll never walk again." I tried my hardest to sound scary, but my voice was quivering at this point. The whole situation made no sense at all. Why would this guy be in the female bathrooms? What was that metal noise? What the fuck was even happening? I very slowly opened the door and scanned my flashlight slowly across the room. All of the cubicles were open, which was weird, but other than that, the room seemed to be totally empty. I was really shitting myself now. I was definitely losing it. I walked into the center of the bathroom, closing the door behind me. I was scared to the core. I let out a faint, "This is some real horror movie shit right here. Hey, come out!" I heard the long, whining squeak of the door behind me. I span around, basically almost crying at this point, only to shine my torch on a fucking massive man. Somehow, this guy was even taller than me. He was Caucasian, and at least in his 40s. He had matte gray hair all over his forehead. He was mid-opening the door, but he stopped dead still in the middle of this action. The man just kinda looked at me, smiling this guilty smile like a kid would make when he got caught stealing biscuits or some shit. I'm not gonna lie, I was so scared I froze. He lifted his finger up to his mouth and whispered, "Shh." He swung the door open all the way and sprinted out with what looked like some kind of small metal box in his hand. Turns out he had been just behind the toilet door when I was opening it, and I'd totally missed him. I was so close to him, and I didn't even notice. He could have easily killed me if he had a knife or something. That thought still haunts me to this day. Later that night, my radio just miraculously started working again. I got right on to telling my coworkers about my story. They collectively went pale when I told them what happened. They all had similar stories, but none were as close of a shave as mine. I worked the night shift for another week after that before I quit. I was not sticking around in a job like that. I needed help, and for some reason my radio just decided to fuck itself. Why? I was not going to deal with a situation like that ever again. This story might not be poop your pants scary or anything like that, but it has left me shaken and very uneasy about working late shifts. Anyways, I had just finished my first year of university and taken up a position as a taxi dispatcher with my boyfriend's cousin's taxi company. For the first week and a half, I worked mainly day shifts until the owner decided to extend the hours to 24/7. I was the lucky employee who would be covering 3 to 4 of these shifts a week. The next week I was working would be my first night shift alone. The driver would be out all night looking for fares, which meant a lot of the night would be just me. I wasn't uneasy working such a shift by myself, since I had worked at a 24-hour coffee shop before and was used to midnight shifts. It was also a Wednesday or Thursday night, so it wasn't particularly busy. The best part about this job was that my boss let me use the internet to play video games on my laptop in the office. From the computer desk in there, I could see the front door, a portion of the front desk, and most of the front windows, so I could easily keep a close eye on what was going on outside. Plus, the bell above the front door would always alert me to a new customer anyway. This meant I wouldn't be caught off guard if I got a little bit too into my game. This particular night, I was working with a taxi driver named Dave. Dave was about 6'3" and 300 pounds, plus he suffered from several health problems, one of which made all his movements slow and painful. He definitely was not Mr. Fitness or the type of person who would be able to defend themselves or others very easily. Sometime during the early hours of the morning, around 1:30 to 2 a.m., Dave got a call to go pick up someone in a town 15 minutes away. He gathered up his things and drove off into the night, while I headed into the office and continued playing my video game. About 15 minutes later, though, I caught something over the top of my laptop. My mind froze immediately. I could hear some panting, and in the reflection of the window, I could see someone sitting down in one of the waiting chairs. I walked to the doorway that connected the front room with the office. I glanced over into the sitting area and nearly shit bricks. Some guy with a massive rat tail had managed to ninja his way into the office and was now sitting in one of the chairs with his face buried in his hands. This guy was extremely dirty and sweaty, and sounded like he had just run a marathon or something. Now, the rat tail should have tipped me off, but I found it more hilarious than frightening. A few moments passed, and I finally got up the courage to ask him if he needed a cab. He didn't respond at first, so I asked him again. He looked up at me, and I took a step back into the office. His face was scratched up and covered in blood from a wound on the top of his head. I was shocked and immediately offered assistance to him. "I'm fine, I don't need help, I just want to go home." I asked him if he needed a cab, and if so, where he would be going. He told me he lived about 20 minutes away and wanted Dave to take him home. After that, shit started to get weird. I called over to Dave using the radio to tell him there was a new fare in the office and he wanted a ride. He told me he'd be another 10 minutes or so. My hand was on the phone the entire time, just in case this guy made any sudden movements. Instead of going back into the office, I decided it was best to stay out front where there were two great big bay windows that would make it easy to see what was happening inside. I didn't feel as though he was a particular threat, but he seemed really angry about something. I wanted to make sure that if something did happen to me, people would be able to see it. I walked out into the front room, and as I got closer to the gentleman, that's when I saw it. He was not just bleeding from the head, but from the shoulder and knees as well. I asked him again if he was okay, and I offered to call an ambulance for him. Bad idea. "You don't need to be doing that," he told me. "It ain't like I killed nobody, right? I never killed nobody. Don't go doing that. You don't need to call anyone. I just need to get home." "Okay, I'm sorry. I just noticed that you're kinda bleeding pretty badly. I thought maybe you'd like someone to make sure you're okay." "I didn't kill nobody. That asshole should have kept his mouth shut. He got what was coming to him. He shouldn't have said those things. But it ain't like I killed nobody, so you don't need to call nobody. I just want to go home." "Okay, but you're bleeding," I told him. "I swear I didn't kill nobody. Please don't call the cops. I don't need the cops. I just need to go home. I didn't kill anyone." There was silence for a few minutes. He noticed the phone clutched in my hand. "I fell down," he blurted out. "Pardon me?" "I fell," he repeated. "That's why I'm bleeding. I fell." He got up and started pacing around. He was growing impatient for his cab, and now I was scared shitless. Blood was on the chair and the floor. I had the phone in my hand, and every once in a while he broke the silence with another string of incoherent babbling about how he had done nothing wrong. He hadn't killed anyone, and I didn't need to call the cops because he was a good guy. Eventually, Dave radioed over that he was about 2 minutes away. I breathed a heavy sigh of relief. He pulled up out front and the man hopped into the car and they drove off. Now I was worried for Dave though. I called the cops. I reported what happened, and they followed the taxi cab to this guy's house, where they arrested him. Turns out this guy had run away from a nearby bar after he'd physically assaulted a fellow patron, injured him with a sharp object, I assume a pocket knife or needle. He'd taken off running, fallen, and managed to find his way to the taxi office. During his time in the cab office, the police had been searching for him. So technically, no, he did not kill anyone, but he did assault and attempt to kill someone. I also found out that one of the other drivers, Steven, knew the guy from high school years ago. This guy's name was Duke, I guess, which explains the rat tail, and he had a long history of violence. He also had a history of coming home drunk and cracking his wife's skull open from time to time. Whether he had planned to do that to me that night, I can't say, but I'm just glad that guy ended up in the drunk tank for the night. His wife was unharmed, and thankfully the guy who got stabbed did not die. At least, I assume he didn't, since I did see Duke every now and then walking the streets with his glorious rat tail, which I assume means he did not get arrested in the end. So this is a true story that happened to me years ago. I'm from Germany and worked at an old people's home in a little German town around this time. The facility was in a very rural area on the outskirts of town. One night, I had a night shift with a new coworker I'd never worked with before. He was in his mid-50s wearing these little round glasses, and for some reason, he seemed a little bit strange to me at first sight. There were always only 2 workers alone in the facility at night, and our job was to watch after over 100 rooms on 3 separate floors and make control rounds through the whole facility. We weren't allowed to use the elevators for security reasons at night and had to use the stairway instead. I remember this particular night had some very strange weather. It was unusually stormy and wild outside when my shift started at about 10 p.m. Around this time, most of the other personnel were gone. Only one older nurse was on the station room on the 2nd floor, where we had our headquarters at night. She wasn't used to the newer PC programs we were using at the time, and it took her a bit longer to finish writing down her stuff for the day. My coworker and I started our first round through the entire area. Using the stairways, which had heavy doors we had to close very slowly and carefully every time to avoid excess noise. Everything was mostly quiet. Most of the old people were asleep already. After we checked all the rooms, we sat down in the 2nd floor station room and finished up some leftover paperwork. The old nurse that was left behind had since finished up all her stuff. All the doors to the outside were shut tight and the house was completely quiet. We were just sitting there together at the table. After about 15 minutes of sitting there in silence, suddenly we heard a heavy door in the stairway smash hard. We looked at each other without saying anything and immediately sprinted toward that noise. I ran up the 3rd floor to search, and my workmates sprinted down to the ground floor. But no matter how hard we searched, we didn't see anything or anybody suspicious. We even checked the stairway windows, and all were closed properly. Someone must have been in the stairway though, we concluded. We found nothing as we continued our tour, rechecking from the 3rd floor all the way down to the ground floor. From there on, I couldn't stop thinking about who the hell would sneak around these floors in the middle of the night. There should only be old people left behind. It was around 2 a.m. when we had to change the double sheets from an old invalid man who'd pissed in his bed. I stood in the corner of the room beside the bed, backed up against the wall. My coworker was on the other side. I remember I was watching the door, kind of just expecting someone to peer into the room at any moment. While I was concentrating on that door though, and lost in my thoughts, suddenly my coworker freaked out of nowhere. He began screaming at the old man, ripping around the sheets and tossing him as well. His face had an extremely angry look. I was shocked and didn't really know what to say or do. I just watched this creepy guy in front of me freak out while some other person was sneaking around the premises unseen. I stood there pressed against that wall in the corner of the room, feeling totally lost. I must have been surrounded by psychopaths or something. We finally went back down to the ground floor. Everything was quiet now. The only sounds were wind blowing fiercely. Suddenly, though, we heard a dropping sound, like someone had just dropped a knife or perhaps something metallic. This time, we knew for sure it had come from the kitchen area. We run to the closed glass door where the sound came from. It was a long, dark hallway with an outdoor leading to the trash cans and parking lot at the end. We opened that door and searched every single room. I felt extremely uncomfortable and expected an attack at any moment, but once again we were unable to find anything. Some hours later, still a bit creeped out, we started our very last tour of this night. We decided to split up this time, and I checked the rooms like usual. When I walked past one particular room, I noticed an old lady was still awake and sat bolt upright on her bed. She asked me if I had been in her room 5 minutes ago. I said no, and we'd both just started our last tours. She told me that 5 minutes ago, someone had entered her room and stood there silently staring at her. She asked who they were, but they didn't answer her back. Then, after a while, the door was quietly closed once again. I got some big chills while listening to the old lady describing her tale. I told her to push the alarm button next time something like that happened. I think it's unnecessary to say how I felt for the next hours of the night every time I entered a room or walked around a corner. I knew some stranger was wandering around here, and I expected him to be standing there at any time. I was more than glad when the damn shift was finally over. Some days later, I met the old nurse who'd left the facility that night earlier and told her what had happened. She told me the back door to the kitchen area had been wide open when she went to her car that night. She had reached the open, dark back door to the parking lot and called out to ask if somebody was there. Suddenly, she got a very, very bad feeling and turned around to run to her car and drove off fast. She was really scared and tried to reach out and warn us, but found that she didn't have the number to connect with us. Well, I told her that back door had definitely been closed when we checked the area before. We never found out who was sneaking around there that night, and many a night shift worker and old person reported similar experiences throughout the following month. The coworker I had worked with that night was fired after more and more complaints about him emerged over time. I'm just glad I don't work there anymore, and I never have to deal with any of that crazy night shift stuff ever again. Around March of 2014, I started talking to this girl on Tinder. She seemed really cool and fun, and after about a week or so of talking, she suggested we meet up in person. She invited me to this coffee shop nearby, and I accepted. The day of, however, she started messaging me a bunch, saying she had to tell me something. The pictures of her on Tinder were not actually of her, you see, and yes, she was a guy. He claimed he really liked talking to me though, and begged me to still meet up with him. Naturally, I declined this offer, and blocked his profile and continued on with my life. About a week later, I started talking to another girl. Once again, she seemed very cool and fun, and we hit it off right away. She asked me if I spoke to people on Tinder frequently, and rather stupidly, I told her about my previous encounter with the man lady. It would take me a few weeks to realize this new girl was the exact same person as the week before. She asked me if I wanted to meet up, and I said sure as long as it was in a public place. We decided on a cafe nearby, and the next day I sat there at the table waiting. 5, 10, 15 minutes had passed and she was nowhere to be found. I then peered out the window and saw from across the street a man staring at me very intently. I looked away, waited a few moments, and looked back. Sure enough, he was still standing there staring at me. At that point, I left the cafe, hopped on my bike, and booked it home as fast as possible. I was definitely more than a little bit freaked out, but I tried to pull myself together and reason that no one could have possibly followed me. I then deleted my Tinder profile, and things were fairly normal for a few weeks after. About 3 weeks later, though, I started getting these phone calls. The numbers all showed up as unknown. I picked up the first few times, only to hear some guy breathing heavily into the phone. I was already freaked out. After about a day, I stopped picking up any call unless it displayed the caller's name. Then I started receiving strange texts. At first, they were pretty harmless, calls for attention and begging me to meet in person. Then, though, they became very sexually charged, until eventually the messages became threatening. Whoever was messaging me started throwing out my family and friends' names and whereabouts, saying he or she would get them involved unless I answered. Because they were texting me now, I could see a displayed number, but when I called phone providers, they told me the number couldn't be traced and was probably a track phone. Great. I waited about 2 weeks not responding to these texts, thinking I shouldn't feed this troll. Eventually, though, it became too much. I started getting upwards of 50 texts and phone calls a day. I would wake up to 10 to 20 every morning. I then decided to change my number altogether. The calls and texts stopped for a while, but sure enough, it started happening again somehow. I called my phone provider asking if they'd ever given out a number at a user's request, and they said their policy stated that they could not unless valid identification was provided. Then one day I tried logging onto my Facebook, only to see that my login was denied. Within a single day, friends had started contacting me, asking what the hell I was doing. Apparently, they were all getting these terrible messages from my account. In particular, one of my girlfriends was receiving messages about her mom who had died years ago. I apologized profusely and told everyone what was going on. I contacted Facebook and explained the situation, and they helped me access my account again, at which point I deactivated it. Enough was enough. I decided to contact the FBI, explaining what had been going on for over a month now. They documented everything, but told me since I or any of my relatives or friends were no immediate danger, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything. At that point, I felt stuck. I thought about hiring a private investigator or possibly a hacker. I decided against it, however, and hoped it would all just fade out if I kept ignoring it. I left my Facebook deactivated and ignored any texts and phone calls. I never had any trouble at home, but some of my closest friends received texts as well, which definitely weirded us all out. I hated that they'd gotten dragged into this. One day I came home, and things felt very eerie suddenly. Door unlocked, windows open, no one home, a strong breeze running through the apartment. I did a thorough check of the place and found nothing else weird, so I locked everything up tight and waited for my roommates to get home. It's been almost 7 months now, and the calls and texts just kind of suddenly stopped. I'll still get the occasional one, but at most every 2 weeks now. At the peak of it, I was receiving hundreds a day. This has definitely affected my social and personal life. I became much more wary of the people around me and my surroundings. I felt like I couldn't really focus on anything until this all stopped. Work was difficult, though I tried to maintain my composure as best I could. Everything was just so weird. Life itself felt weird. I've since stopped using all forms of dating apps and websites. Things are finally getting back to normal, and at this point I kinda just want to put it all behind me. I'm moving at the end of this year, so it'll be nice to have a fresh start in a new place. I'm not gonna sit here and say all dating apps are dangerous and no one should use them or anything like that, but definitely cover your bases. Ask questions before meeting anyone. FaceTime them first, Skype, anything. I was naive about this, and I really regret it. Be safe and stick close to your friends. Try meeting people in more traditional ways if you can. Let me preface this by saying that this story happened when I was a lot younger and less worldly wise about the creeps of the world. Had I known back then what I know now, this story would have ended before it even began. Unfortunately, this story begins when I, a 16-year-old girl, got bored one day and decided to download a version of the Tinder app. After a couple of swipes, a guy's face popped up. What intrigued me was that he didn't have his name in his profile. Now, he didn't seem like a rapper or anything like that, so I swiped out of curiosity. We matched right away and began talking. Just a pretty run-of-the-mill conversation to start. What do you do for fun? Been to any parties recently? That sort of thing. After a bit of digging, it emerged that he went to the school at the bottom of my road, so we arranged to meet up that weekend. At this point, I didn't even have his real name. I felt too awkward to ask it though. After all, we'd been talking for all this time. Saturday came and Mark turned up about 20 minutes late. He was carrying a rose, presumably to make up for the fact that he was only around 5'2", which he'd very cleverly omitted in the photos he'd posted. I'm not usually into short guys, but I figured why not give it a chance, you know? We went and sat in a park at the town center to talk. We talked for about 2 hours about everything and nothing at all, until Mark asked if he could be so bold as to kiss me. I was flattered, but I declined. He persisted, saying this was very important, until finally I lost my temper and asked him why. He explained to me that he suffered from these sex-based migraines, and if he was deprived of sexual contact for too long, he would get this excruciating headache that would render him immobile for 48 hours. Although I was naive, I was not stupid enough to believe that nonsense. I wanted to get home quickly though after this meeting had suddenly turned sour. I leaned over and gave him a quick peck on the cheek, then hurried away to the piercing parlor across the road, where the owners knew me and talked with me for about an hour, at least until I felt secure enough to get the bus home. I thought that would be the end of the encounter, and traveled home quite calmly. You know, just another mediocre date. Me and my mother never had a strong relationship, and I didn't want to talk to her about something like this. Because of this, when she asked how my day was, I sort of brushed it off and said I'd met up with a friend for lunch. After dinner, I went upstairs to my room and pulled out my phone. My stomach dropped immediately. There was a Snapchat notification from that guy. I don't know how he got it. Maybe my username was the same on the profiles or something like that. I don't really know. I gingerly opened it. It was a 10-second video of him lying in his bed at home, looking dazed and confused. The caption? "Look what you did to me." I realized he was actually faking a migraine and filming it to send to me. I blocked this account, needless to say, and sat there watching TV for a while. No harm done, just one more thing to deal with, I thought. From knowing where I went to school and the fact that I have a somewhat unusually spelled first name, a friend request came in from Mark a couple of days later. I declined it, and he sent one again. I was a little bit weirded out. He seemed to have some mutual friends with me, and from his profile I figured I could learn a bit more about him, i.e. how to avoid him. The messages started pouring in immediately, starting with, "I really enjoyed today. I hope we can see each other again soon," and ending with such gems as, "I need you. You're mine." I laughed and blocked him again. One day I was getting my bus to school when a familiar face smiled at me from the bus stop. It was Mark again, this time with his friends. I wasn't suspicious immediately. After all, my bus stop was just opposite to his school. I vaguely knew one of his friends as well. I smiled and made false pleasantries until my bus came. This was only the first of my many encounters with Mark though, all of which I brushed off as a coincidence. He lived and went to school in the same part of town as I did, so it wasn't uncommon for me to go a day without seeing someone I knew. This is why I didn't put it together at first. The very last encounter though I had was on my way to meet a friend. The week before, I had severely twisted my knee playing netball and was struggling to walk from my bus stop to where my friend had arranged to meet me. As I turned the corner, who should appear but Mark, smiling and greeting me with a wave. He asked me what had happened to my leg, and I told him honestly I'd received an injury. He asked me where I was going. I told him I was meeting my friend. He asked what time I was meeting her. I said in about an hour. He told me his house was right around the corner, and putting his hand firmly on my lower back, He offered that I could wait there with a cup of tea until my friend arrived. I tried to protest, saying I would be fine waiting in a cafe, but there wasn't much I could do as Mark guided me and pushed me towards his house. When we got in, I asked if I could use the bathroom, to which he said yes and showed me to. I texted my friend after locking myself inside. I told her that a guy I vaguely knew had pushed me into his house and she had to pick me up from there as soon as possible. Well, I didn't tell her the entire story. I didn't want to worry her or have her phone my mother, with whom I would have met a worse fate than Mark, I believe. Mark repeatedly knocked on the door asking if I was okay. I said yes, but that I'd be a couple of minutes, and he agreed to wait downstairs for me. When I let myself out of the bathroom, I walked downstairs only to find Mark lying motionless on the floor. I panicked, thinking something must have happened to him, and went to check his pulse. As I reached down, though, his hand shot out immediately to feel my breast through my shirt, and he weakly croaked out, "Need release." I batted his hand away and tried to stand up. "I need you. Feel me." His trousers, which I had not looked at until now, were unbuttoned, and he was stroking himself, eyes now wide open and locked onto me. Needless to say, I freaked out. I ran back up the stairs and struggled with the lock on the door, hearing his slow footsteps getting closer. Just as I was opening it, his voice called out from the other end of the corridor. "Could you at least help me clean my oven then?" I whisked the door open and slammed it behind me, almost in tears at both the pain in my knees and the sheer strangeness of this situation. After managing to get out and limping a couple of roads down from his house, I rang my friend and said there was nothing particular to worry about, but could she please hurry? Luckily, she was right around the corner at this point. We drove off with me telling her everything, in between shaky breaths. The weirdest thing about this story is that only a couple of days later I ran into Mark again, and he acted like nothing had ever happened that day, even offered me some gum, and caught a bus from my bus stop. It's almost like he didn't even remember what happened. I sure as hell wish I didn't. Knock on wood, I haven't seen him around in some time, but that could be because he's gone off to university. He's around the right age to have. When I was a teenager, I worked for a concert production company and a couple of related companies that did merch at local shows. The venues for these shows range from festivals to all-ages venues to even the occasional huge gig. This encounter takes place at a teen girl pop show. Word to the wise, if you work in the music business and want to take a glimpse behind the curtain of true creeperhood, go to a show put on by a teenage female musician. Most of the audience were teenagers, sure, but there were a depressingly high amount of weird guys who didn't appear to have any daughters in tow. My job at this particular show was to walk through the crowd and sell stuff. Not really a bad job by any means. Lots of exercise, a very fun atmosphere, and you got to watch the show for free. Kind of, sort of. It wasn't that great when it was Christina Aguilera or Hilary Duff or something, but when it was a band you liked, that was pretty awesome. Anywho, about 2/3 of the way through the show, I sold all my glow sticks and had to duck backstage to get some more. Turns out the entire stash back there was all gone too. Because of this, one of the management guys gave me some keys and told me to head down to the lower level to grab some out of storage. This was the level that had the locker rooms and access tunnels for the basketball team that usually played there. The lower level that wasn't taken up by sports stuff was mostly assorted weird storage and access tunnels, not really an area of the arena that I was super familiar with. Well, once I took the elevator down, it suddenly hit me that despite the fact that there was a show going on right that second, the entire lower level on my side of the arena was completely deserted. In a 14,000 plus seat building, this was kind of weird. Unless it was way after hours, there was almost never any time you were completely alone. I got about 100 or so feet down the hallway from the elevator, then rounded a corner. I actually thought I was seeing a zombie for a second. There was a relatively young adult man just standing there in the middle of the hallway, kind of twitching and gurgling like he was having trouble breathing. He kept on making these really weird noises from the back of his throat, and he was staring up at the lights on the ceiling. After reminding myself that zombies aren't actually real, I worried this person might be having a seizure, so I did something really stupid. "Hey, are you okay?" It didn't even occur to me that calling out to a strange adult acting weirdly in a deserted area would be bad news for a skinny teenage girl. His head snapped immediately, and the look on his face was angry and malicious. He didn't look like he was in distress. He looked like he was about to fucking kill me. He was pretty normal looking otherwise. Decent hygiene, clean shaven, not dressed like a slob, but there was something in his eyes that was not right. It was like he couldn't see I was there at all. Obviously, I did the bravest thing possible. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back to the elevator. I can't say for sure, but I think I heard footsteps chasing after me. Maybe I just imagined it though. I reported him to the venue security because he was in a secure area. So secure, in fact, that in theory the elevator should have had a guard down there at all times. But for whatever reason, this time it hadn't. Maybe he didn't even use the elevator to get down there. Who knows how or why he did. I never personally found out what happened, but the paper reported the next day that 6 people had been arrested for drug use at the venue. I really wondered if he may have been one of them. If he was tweaked out of his mind, it would have explained the completely terrifying behavior. It wouldn't really explain, though, why he was an adult male, possibly on his own, in a secure area at a girls' pop show for young teens, though. When I was roughly 6 or 7 months pregnant with my daughter, my cousin asked me to go to an Evanescence concert with her in a neighboring city. We were both pretty excited and had really decent seats that were front of stage too, right behind the floor/standing area. Since I was pretty far along, my cousin offered to go and get us some drinks and a snack to tide us over until after the concert. She had only been gone for about 5 minutes when this older man sat down right next to me. Immediately, the man began to strike up a conversation about the concert. You know, if I'd heard of the opening band before, casual concert chatter. He was slightly overweight, balding, and had this real oddness to him. Not wanting to be too rude, I gave short answers and fiddled around on my phone, hoping he'd get the idea I wasn't really interested in talking to a random person. A few minutes of awkward silence passed by when he suddenly began asking questions regarding my pregnancy. They weren't the typical questions either. How big would my breasts get? Does my baby fall asleep or get squirmy when I have an orgasm? And a few other things along those lines. Needless to say, I was extremely uncomfortable and decided to just ignore this guy. Another man a row behind us heard all of these and tapped me on the shoulder to ask if I was okay. He glared at the pervert until he finally left. I breathed a sigh of relief and thanked the kind stranger. He told me no problem and said to give him the word if the pervert came back. Thankfully, my cousin returned only a few minutes later and the concert began. It wasn't until halfway through the show, when Evanescence took a quick break, that the pervert suddenly showed up again right next to me. This time, he laughingly said the concession attendant had given him an extra fountain soda by mistake and offered it to me. I politely told him no and told him I didn't like soda. My cousin had already gotten me a drink anyway. He glared at me and really insisted I take this beverage from him. Finally, to shut him up, I took it and put it on the floor between my cousin and I. He seemed very happy when I grabbed it, and for the rest of the concert I could see him eyeing me and muttering something to himself. When the concert finished and we got up to leave, the man grabbed my hand. I felt bile rise up in my throat and snatched my hand away from him. He looked shocked that I'd done this, then glanced down at the untouched soda. Immediately, he began to scream at me for not drinking his gift and how he'd bought it especially for me. How funny. I thought he'd said they'd given him an extra on accident. The man would not let me pass by. The place was crowded with people trying to get to their cars. I felt trapped, and this guy was becoming more irate by the second about me not drinking his damn drink, so I did the only thing I could think of. I pissed myself and started screaming my water had broken. That got people moving damn fast out of our way, and we were finally able to lose the guy in the crowd. We made it home with no other incidents, and the entire time my cousin was apologizing for being absolutely clueless. This was after I explained to her that I wasn't really in labor and I just pissed myself. I still have no idea what that guy was after, but I really feel like he must have slipped something into that drink. As a brief introduction for some background on how this happened, allow me to say I'm an old-school metalhead. I travel around my tri-state area to see various heavy metal shows. The town I live in is a pretty small town with no real musical scene, outside of some hip-hop and pop music. No venue here really has anything I'd like to pay money to see. As such, I'm forced to travel at least an hour or so away to see any shows I'd really like. This has me often traveling with my wife, my favorite concert buddy. Usually, we go clear across the state to see concerts. There's this one particular venue we love to frequent, but it's a good 3.5-hour drive away. It always has great metal acts playing there though, many even coming from Europe. When we go to this place, we usually stay in a hotel/casino that's about 3 or 4 blocks away from the venue. It's a very short walk. This particular night, we just finished up seeing Dark Tranquillity, a Swedish melodic death metal band. It was about 2 a.m. when we got out of the venue, as we'd stayed behind for a bit afterward hoping to meet either Dark Tranquillity or some of the opening bands afterwards. This can happen quite often actually at small venues like this. We did, so it was a little while after the show before we got out of there. We left and began to make the walk back to the hotel. At this point, there were tons of fellow metalheads milling out as well, and it was kind of a general idea for many of us to stay in the same hotel. After all, it was right around the corner, like I said, just a few blocks over. This meant we were all kind of walking there together in this big mob. Now, if you're into the heavy metal scene and frequent live shows, you'll know it's a fairly tightly knit community. We're all there for the same reason, so everyone is usually pretty friendly and talkative, discussing the show, past shows, the meeting of band members, lots of really jovial discussion. I'd had to piss for over an hour at this point, but I hadn't wanted to dip into the restroom during the end of the band's show. Afterwards, it had been packed with a line flowing out back onto the floor. At this point, though, it was hitting me pretty hard. I'd also had a few drinks in the club as well, so I really couldn't hold it anymore. Rather than wait till we get back to our room and pissing myself, I decided I needed to stop at a public restroom down at the bottom of the parking garage and take this piss. It really needed to happen. My wife didn't mind very much, as she needed to go herself, so we split off onto our own ways. I come into the restroom and think I'm by myself, so I hit the first urinal there and start my go at it. As I'm about to finish up, the door creaks open, and this rather large bald fellow walks in. He stopped dead in his tracks right in front of the door for a moment. He took me in, like he didn't expect anyone else to be in there. Then he went to the sink as I was doing the same, and started washing his face. I started washing my hands, and he looked over at me with water running off of his nose. He asked me what I was doing out here so late. I explained I was coming back from a concert without even looking at him. He then started to ask what kind of music, and I explained to him that it was a heavy metal concert. He kinda shrugged and nodded and said, "Cool." I finished up and dried my hands. He turned around and grabbed my upper arm. "Hey, then maybe you're interested in buying something I have." He started to rifle through his jeans pockets and mumbled that it must be in there somewhere. I tried politely telling him I was not interested and needed to go, but he shuffled in front of me quickly, blocking off the doorway. He looked extremely angry at this point and jutted out his shoulders. He was probably a good foot taller than me. I'm a fairly short guy, so this isn't really hard to do, but still, this guy was huge. Look, man, no need to be rude. Don't be a dick. I again declined, trying to stay polite. At this point, I was starting to tense up, anticipating a huge scuffle. The problem is, I was exhausted. I just spent the better part of 3 hours jumping around and smashing my body into other people. Quite frankly, I was ready to collapse, not fight. The guy grabbed my arm again, this time a lot harder. Hey man, I'm fucking talking to you. My sense of trying to be reasonable had left me behind at this point. I was too tired to give a shit anymore. Knowing I shouldn't, I told him, man, you're the one being an asshole. I'm fucking tired and I'm just trying to get the fuck out of here, so get out of my damn way. The man shoved me back and stepped in closer. I was trying to be nice. Fuck you. You trying to start some shit with me? It ran through my head that while I almost usually always have a pocket knife on me, in case things like this happen to go down, at this point I was completely unarmed. I couldn't bring the knife with me into the venue club through their security. I was preparing for the worst. This guy was clearly hopped up on something and was a good deal bigger than me. I was really going to lose this fight hard, and it was about to get hairy. The guy was blocking my way to the door too, so there was really no way past him. Just as I was thinking I was done for, the door creaked open again, and I heard laughter and talking start to flood in. The guy let go of my arm suddenly and turned around to look. A group of 5 guys in black shirts, studded leather jackets adorned with dozens of band logo patches, and jeans strolled into the restroom. One of them was a Hispanic fellow with long curly dark hair. He waved to me excitedly. Oh dude, what's up? That was a sick fucking show tonight, huh? One of his friends, another Hispanic guy with a shaved head, took in what might have been going on here. Hey, this fucker giving you shit, man? I looked back to the bald assailant. A worried expression had crossed over his features. Even being a pretty big guy, he was now 6'1", and all of them were at his back. A few of them were even bigger than him, too. They were all pretty decked out from the show as well, so they must have been pretty intimidating looking to an average person not from a metal scene. He glanced at me for a split second. Oh, nah, man, we were just talking. I interjected quickly, fed up with this jackass. Yeah, and now we're done talking. Get the fuck out of my way. And next time, don't be a dickhead if you know what's good for you. I started to barge past him, pushing him aside. The Hispanic dude with the long hair turned back to me as I was passing and told me to have a good night. I met up with my wife, who had decided to stay outside for a smoke. She asked me what took so long, joking that I had to take a huge shit, and I told her about everything as we were going up the elevator into the hotel. We decided to stop in at the in-hotel bar and grill before returning to our room, as we were both kind of hungry. After ordering, we were standing by the counter for a few minutes when I hear laughter and loud voices coming in from the lobby. The same group of 5 guys was coming our way, back toward the snack shop and bar and grill. The long-haired guy saw us and said, "Shit, dude, look at that." He pointed to the window, looking out to the lobby, down into the entrance of the parking garage. I could see the bald guy down there, laying on the ground and clearly being handcuffed by 2 police officers standing over him. One of them had his taser in hand and its line was connected to the guy's side. He told me apparently the guy had stuck around in the restroom as they'd left, and one of them went over to a parked police car a few aisles over in the garage after noticing there was an officer inside. They told him the guy was on something in there, and he'd been acting threatening and kind of shady. Apparently, the officer and his partner decided to step inside the restroom and take a look. As the guys from the concert were going up the elevator to the hotel lobby, they'd heard some shouting and looked down to see the guy being drug out by both officers. I guess he tried to fight them or something. Apparently, there had been a big scuffle before one of them tasered him. And then it ended up as we all saw now, with him getting cuffed and dragged into the police car. We all had a good laugh about it actually, and talked while we waited on our food. Nice guys really. I connected with some of them on Facebook, and we're still friends to this day. This happened around 10 to 12 years ago, and I'd almost completely forgotten about it until now. It's a somewhat short story, but at the time it absolutely terrified me. You see, when I was younger, my entire block was filled with kids around my age. At the time, that was around 9 to 11, I think. I can't remember how exactly old I was. We would all play around the neighborhood near this cemetery that was right next to my house. We all used to play until after dark, playing games like Ghost in the Graveyard and Tag along with all that other fun stuff. It wasn't particularly uncommon for us to be completely unattended around the block. It was a relatively safe neighborhood after all. I still live in the same house to this day, and I'm surprised this even happened. This particular day, my best friend and I, who was 2 years younger than me, decided to go look at the gravestones in the cemetery. We went in there and started browsing, amazed by all the dates and names we found. We were so preoccupied, in fact, that we didn't notice this man who was walking aimlessly alone in the cemetery, not looking at any graves in particular, just sort of shambling around. I saw him and told my friend that maybe we should head back now. The guy was a bit creepy, and we were just scrawny little girls. She agreed, and we decided to go. Just as we were about to exit the cemetery, this older woman stopped us. "You girls shouldn't come in here at night. There are creeps that walk through here." She gave a knowing, creepy smile. We told her sorry and we were just playing. We went back on our way. When we got back to our houses, we continued playing in the front yard, doing what little girls are wont to do, when suddenly I looked up, only to see that same man from the cemetery, standing a distance away. I was a little bit creeped out, but I didn't know at the time that this was something to watch out for. The man started to walk up to us, trying to talk to us. We just kept playing and running around like we didn't notice him, and eventually we moved to the backyard instead, where we felt a lot safer. We waited for an hour or so for when we thought that guy would leave. We thought it was safe to venture back into the front yard now, but we could see him there, just sitting on the curb staring at the house. I could now see that he wasn't dressed particularly nicely, and maybe hadn't taken a bath in a while. Despite it being summer, he had a hat on, kinda like this thick beanie. We got really creeped out at this point and ran over to our moms. My friend's dad came out and tried to shoo him away, and we thought that would be it. Another hour goes by again though, when we see the same man standing right next to our neighbor's backyard, trying to pet their dogs. We ran in and told her dad again, and he ordered us to stay inside. We watched interested from the window, and God, I wish I had not. My best friend's dad ran across the street just in time to see the man standing near the same yard with a bite from the dog on the one hand, and the dog itself dead in the other. He ran down the alley just before my friend's dad could reach him. Our parents called the cops immediately, but I don't think that guy was ever found. I think it's time for me to post a creepy story about an incident that happened about 2 years ago, and this seems like as good a place as any to share. First of all, let me talk to you about the cemetery and the area around it. Now, this cemetery was very visually stunning. It had a completely open area where you could see all the graves around and into the distance, as well as a spooky maze-like section with nature overwhelming the gravestones and overgrown plants everywhere. There was also this large church located at the far end. It was very eerie but also picturesque at the same time. Before this incident happened, I never really cared about this graveyard all that much though. I would walk past it when having to go meet my friends or when I took a shortcut through just to get home, and very recently to get to college as well. The cemetery was next to some spooky alleyways too, and a council estate, so you had to watch your back when you walked through this place. There was constant rumors of drug dealers, muggers, and all sorts of unsavory characters roaming the area at night. Nevertheless, the cemetery was not too interesting to me. until my friend told me a bizarre story involving his brothers and their friends. At nighttime, the brothers and their friends used to play this game inside the cemetery at night. I don't recall my friend telling me the explicit name or anything like that, but that's not really that important, I suppose. The gist is, they were being typical teenagers, causing mischief to make the day worth it, since the district had the excitement of watching grass grow. After about 20 minutes of doing this little game, they began to notice that something was off. They suddenly felt like they were being watched. The atmosphere had turned very dark and bleak as well. Tension was hanging among them, because now they knew they were not alone. And then soon enough, one of the guys saw something. A person, wearing a cloak, and holding something beside them. The person seemed to be crouching under gravestones and silently trying to move from one to the other, getting ever closer. When they noticed, they informed the others of the situation. They turned, all of them. Before the others could even say a word in response, the cloaked man began to run after them, holding a hammer in his hand. This guy was insanely fast, but due to the adrenaline rush and sport background of the opposing forces, these teens were much faster. I don't want to take over their story or make it much longer, so I'll finish by saying they jumped over a big fence and did escape the cloaked man. The second they jumped over, a large thud was heard, and the fence pushed forward a bit. The man had smacked the fence with his large hammer in rage. That was certainly enough force to crack open a skull. Afterwards, they got home, and two of them told their brother, my friend. At first, I didn't really believe this story, and neither did anyone else really. The person who told it to me, Sam though, didn't seem like a person who would lie a lot, and he seemed very serious as well. I thought it was just his brothers trying to trick him and scare him, but I thought to myself, hey man, fuck it, I'll go see if this cloaked man is really there, and you guys are all coming with me. A day after presenting my friends with this little adventurous idea, I began planning where we should meet and how we were going to go about this quest. Suddenly, my friend David texted me. He had already gone looking for this cloaked man the night before with his friends. His encounter was a little less frantic than the other confrontation, but this time a bit more outlandish as well. David had gone with two other people. When they went deep into the cemetery's open area, one of the guys shouted out, "Hey, no face!" Dave tried to tell him to shut up, but he wouldn't stop. The group carried on through the pathway, surrounded by all these graves, until they reached a large shed. David and the others hid behind a bush, and finally saw the man. It seemed the cloaked man was inside this shed examining various weapons, a large hammer, a rusty-looking wrench, and a decaying machete. Eventually, he stopped and walked out of the shed and off into the church. Unexpectedly, the church bells rang, quite loudly as well. The guys watching didn't exactly know what was going on here. The bell was ringing for a good minute. At that point, Dave told the others to get up and go back to another spot. They hid behind a bench this time, being further away from this strange church. The cloaked man came back out, looking concerned like he had noticed something out of place. He was wielding an axe this time as well. Panic rushed through everyone behind the bench, making everyone involved quickly agree to get the hell out. They tried to sneak away, but David kept his eyes locked on that cloaked man. What he did next, though, gave my friend various amounts of what the fuck thoughts forever. The cloaked man just kind of stopped dead in his tracks and fell over to the ground. What the hell was this guy doing? He was crawling around the gravestones rapidly, going from one to the other like he was enacting a scene from The Grudge. However, he was not just doing that. He was making these weird noises too. He was spewing out these weird growling animal sounds that conquered the frigid, emotionless graveyard. Abruptly, he got up and smashed one of the gravestones with his axe for no reason, and let out a haunting scream to the skies. Well, at that point, they said fuck hiding and all ran away. The cloaked man didn't even try to chase them. Instead, he kind of aimlessly looked off into the distance. When he finished his story of discovering more about this mysterious man, I thought there might not be any point to going now. We all knew for sure that this cloaked man was real and was apparently just a weirdo that preyed on teens and poor short-lived gravestones. What else could you really find out just by watching him? Well, I'm big on adventure, so I thought that David, Sam, and I, and many others should go and explore just a bit more. Just see what else this guy does. Might be interesting. A few days later, we put together our all-star team. Sam, David, Charlie, Mike, and I. Charlie was a fat slob and Mike was the funny man of the group, so we all met up at the local tube station, in daytime. Yeah, we were going to go at nighttime at first, but everyone, including me, wussed out, so instead we went in the middle of the day. We walked slowly through the empty alleyways and the council houses until we got to the gates, which we found locked. We hopped over, though, and began our adventure. Sadly, Charlie and Mike were already not having it and climbed back out. They weren't going to be too far, they were just going to wait for us outside. We wanted them to come too, but after about a minute of trying to convince them, we left them behind and walked through the large pathway with the gravestones around us. Instead of going straight over to the shed, we decided to take another route. All of us went through the claustrophobic maze-like section, where the gravestones were covered over with overgrown plants. We began walking around and arguing amongst each other as well. Sam was bored and wanted out. Dave didn't care that much, and I wanted to go back out into the open and find this shed. 5 minutes of pointless arguing in, suddenly we heard footsteps around us. We looked all around but saw nothing. "Dude, grab your phone," Sam said to me. "Alright, hold on a moment." I got my phone out and unlocked it and went to the camera. I was pointing at the remoteness with my iPhone, but nothing was lurking in the distance or anything like that. At least, not that we could see. We knew someone was near us, so we began to frantically walk through this maze. Sam told me to begin recording, so I did just that. Since nothing was happening again, the recording just became a dragged-out video of us walking around like idiots, looking in every direction. I switched that damn phone off, and we went deeper into this maze. It got darker and darker and tighter and tighter. And then I saw it. The cloaked man was following us. I finally saw that fucker. When I looked behind, I noticed he was hidden right behind this huge angel statue, and he was stupidly close. "Guys, he's right there behind us. Let's get the fuck out of here." David, being the confident and curious guy of the group, walked back and tried to catch the guy. I didn't want to see this person pop out, but I wasn't leaving my friend behind, so we all went to see behind the statue. Somehow, he was already gone. Sam began to get scared and wanted to go home. He had this crawling feeling that the cloaked man was still staring at us. We continued on, though, being young idiots, and that's when I spotted him once again, this time on the other side. He was a little bit further away from us, but I could see him trying to get closer, blending in with the trees. I started to really freak out. Dave and Sam noticed him as well, so we ran about 30 feet away and tried to hide. The cloaked man was now going in the other direction and entered the church, which was noticeable where we hid. We heard those bells begin to chime. David confirmed those were the same ones he'd heard that other night. Then the cloaked man emerged with his huge axe. Without any hesitation, he charged at our direction immediately. We were still in the maze-like area of the cemetery, but we could see that open area in the distance where the gravestones and church were located. He was far away, but definitely charging right at us. He knew we were there. Even though we were hiding and nowhere near him, he still knew where we were. He didn't change directions or anything. He sprinted in a single line with the axe in both hands. As I realized he was getting closer and closer, I screamed to run, and we legged it. We ran, and I looked behind. He was right there, ready to swing his axe at us. We didn't want to split up, so we ran around the maze until we found a pathway with large hedges on the side. No going back now. We all ran and ran through the path, but after running down, I was beginning to have a heart attack. When I looked in front, I felt so much fear. I was losing hope. This was a dead end. My friends and I were greeted by a locked shed at the end of the path. with no way to get in, no way to climb on top either. We had the feeling of dread taking over our bodies. We waited there for a few moments, and the cloaked man didn't come. We silently went the other direction and stumbled back to the overgrown plant gravestone maze. We looked everywhere, finding broken tombstones and ripped up branches all over the place. There was silence for about 10 minutes. We searched in every direction, hoping the cloaked man had given up and was really gone. All of us were sneaking around as best we could until we finally got out of the maze and the claustrophobic feeling of that horrible area disappeared. The mundane gray clouds that suddenly appeared above made the open cemetery look even more disturbing and bleak than it already was. As we walked on, we could hear a thunderstorm starting, and it looked like it was going to rain. We tried to jog out of there. We looked up, only to see something sticking out. Holy shit. The cloaked man was in the distance, his hood off, standing on top of a gravestone. His face was partially visible, but not exactly. He was wearing a cliché Halloween mask for some reason. We stared at him for about 20 seconds before he got down and began crawling in our direction. Well, fuck that. We ran until we jumped over the fence. Charlie and Mike weren't there. The bastards must have gotten bored and left, but I guess I can't really blame them. After that, we were all freaked out and decided never to go to that cemetery again, although I did go there years later to film some things for college assignments. After that, we went home and that was pretty much it. The next day, though, I walked through a street with a cemetery on the left side and saw red tape and police in the graveyard right next to that church. I wish I had asked the police officer what was going on, but I was too freaked out to go back there to check, even with the police all around. I never did find out what exactly happened there, and to think of it now, I don't think I really want to know. There were rumors that the guy that was stalking and chasing all of us was just the caretaker wearing a mask, trying to scare people who went to the cemetery and tried to mess around. The police investigation probably had nothing to do with the cloaked man, at least I hope not, but I guess I can't really be sure. This incident happened to a relative of mine and his younger cousin, as well as a few of their friends. I'll name this relative Dave. He and his wife were in their 20s at the time this happened, and had not been married particularly long. This incident happened around the 1990s. Dave also had a younger cousin who was being raised by her grandparents. The grandparents lived out in the country, and there were not a lot of kids her age around to hang with. This meant that Dave and his wife would often invite her along if they were driving into the nearest city to see a movie, play mini golf, or do anything like that. It happened to be the cousin's 13th birthday, and she wanted to have a sleepover. It was decided this would be held at Dave's house. She invited 5 of her closest friends as well. Well, Dave and his wife themselves were not exactly all that mature, and when around the kids, they would act like kids right along with them. Anyway, they decided later that night to all go to a graveyard together, I guess just for a thrill or something. It's not like there was really much in our tiny town to do anyway. In our small town, the graveyards around this area were all located out in the woods. This particular one was surrounded by a really thick batch with no houses nearby at all. It was fairly small and had a chain-link fence around it, as well as a street light near the gate where you enter. I think there hadn't even been that street light until a caretaker installed it at some point, presumably to deter teenagers from drinking and partying there. Dave, his wife, and the 6 girls all exited the car and walked around the graveyard. They were all laughing, joking, chasing each other, telling scary ghost stories, trying to spook each other. Really just doing a lot of teenage girl stuff. They finally got tired of playing around and decided to go back to Dave's house. They all went and got back in Dave's large 70s model car. The girls piled into the back, and of course he and his wife hopped into the front. All of the girls were talking and giggling amongst each other, being silly. while Dave, sitting in the driver's seat, was getting ready to crank up the car. While this was going on, though, they heard a sudden tap on the driver's side window. It wasn't a tap like someone using their knuckles. It was more of a ting, 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 the sound that it might make when someone was tapping with a light metal object. Everyone looked toward that sound, only to see a man standing there, holding a machete. The tip of that machete was what he had used to tap on the window with. Dave and his wife said this guy was dressed like Rambo. He was not wearing a shirt and had some kind of rag wrapped around his head. It was painted up with green and brown paint. I guess kind of like army guys paint themselves when they go on maneuvers. Dave, for some reason, assumed this was possibly someone needing help, so he began to open his door and get out to talk to the guy. When he did this, his wife and all the girls started screaming at him and diving for the door. The girls were diving all from the back seat and his wife across the seat as well. They all pulled it shut together and locked it, then frantically began locking all the other doors. They began to scream at him even more, telling him to get the fuck out of there. While he was putting the key in the ignition, the guy did this sort of weird karate move, like you might see on TV. Dave cranked it up and they took off out of there. Later that night, they rode back to the graveyard to see if he was still there. Of course, this time they had the doors locked and did not get out. They thought they could see someone lying on one of the graves toward the back of the graveyard, but perhaps it could have just been a trick of the lighting. We still don't know to this day who this individual was. I believe he was either on drugs or mentally ill, perhaps. It creeped all of them out, though, that this very strange guy was hiding in the graveyard watching them earlier, when they were all walking around out there laughing and having fun, totally oblivious to his presence. So I used to work from 4 p.m. to 12:25 a.m. Before I accepted those hours, my brother agreed to take me home each day. Well, he slacked off on that deal numerous times, and I was left to walk or skateboard home very late at night. I suppose I could have taken a taxi, but at the time I really didn't want to pay. These trips from work to my house would take an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how lazy I was feeling that night. The route I took was extremely simple as well. It was pretty much a straight shot. It was through one of the scariest and most ghetto parts of Phoenix, Arizona, though. Needless to say, I was already in a pretty bad mood this night because my brother had once again bailed on being my ride. By the way, this was a few years ago, roughly 3 or 4, I think. There I am, making my way home in the cold, lonesome dark. I'd been on foot already for 15 to 20 minutes, and I was about to go underneath the freeway. I noticed a car coming up on my way. No big deal. People are always up around this area, no matter what the time of day is. I just kept on walking, but when I looked up, I noticed the driver was staring right at me. He was still driving by very slowly, but his eyes and head were focused on me. I figured it was just a guy being weird and rubbernecking. He drove about 50 feet down when he suddenly did a U-turn and came back towards my way. My heart dropped immediately, and I realized this guy might be a real danger. Again, I watched as he drove by, his eyes strictly focused on me. He sped up and drove ahead. I stared at his car the whole time, hoping he would just leave and go on his way. But no, he made a left turn into a bank's parking lot and shut off all his lights. I was on the side of the road nearer to him. I just kept walking, my eyes searching everywhere for him. I knew I had to keep him in my sight. I kept walking because it was all I could do. Luckily, there was a low-cut wall and some dirt to space out the parking lot he was in, and the sidewalk I was on apart from each other. I walked for a minute or so when I noticed the car parked right there by the wall. I could make out the shape of a man. The door opened, and he quickly hopped out of his car. I knew now he had some awful intentions for me. I ran and jumped on my skateboard and pushed the hardest I could, the fastest my feet would allow me. I heard the man yelling at me from behind. I saw him quickly hop into his car and restart the engine. I skated the fastest I could to an empty intersection. He drove by me, keeping those shady eyes on me. He sped ahead and again made a turn somewhere in the distance. This time I stayed at a post office, trying to figure out what I could do. I didn't have a phone, and all I could think of was how I could get out of this situation. I knew he was waiting for me just up ahead. I decided to go back and go up across a bridge to a gas station instead. I kept on searching for his car, but I didn't see him around. At the gas station, I decided not to use the phone. Don't really know why. I decided just to use a different route going home instead. It was much longer, and I arrived home at 3 a.m. I went to the kitchen to see my brother's television on, the light coming from underneath his door. I was too tired to be mad though. I just got to my room, went to sleep, and pretended I'd had a bad nightmare. I wonder what that man wanted from me. I was 19 then, and my hair was somewhat long, but from a distance I might look like a guy. It was clear I had no money as well. Why else would I be skating home at such an odd time of day? I skated home a few more times after, but I never did see that man again. So let me start off by saying I move around a lot in between SoCal and Arizona. At the time of this incident, December 2015, I was still living in SoCal at my grandparents' apartments. I had gotten a seasonal job at Toys R Us to do something with my time and learn some people skills. I'm a 24-year-old girl and have some pretty extreme social anxiety. I sometimes find it really hard to talk to people, so I figured this job might help me with that. Another important thing to mention, my grandmother is on a government program with reduced housing cost and has a 2-bedroom apartment ever since my grandfather passed away. Due to the annual check at her complex, she's supposed to be the only inhabitant of her dwelling, so technically I was not supposed to be living there with her. She liked the help and the company though, and I liked being rent-free. Now, since I wasn't technically supposed to be there, I technically had to sneak around, and most definitely could not park on the parking grounds for the complex. That would draw too much attention. There was, though, a cemetery right across the street from the complex, and then a half-mile of houses leading down the street to the next cemetery, along which most of the visitors for the houses and apartments nearby parked, including myself. I was getting to stay rent-free and staying with my grandma who I loved, which was awesome to me, even if it meant I had to park a half-mile away and walk a little bit. I didn't exactly mind much. All was well and good for a few months from when I got the job in October, minus a scary incident with a stalker at work. I'll leave that story for another time. Eventually, though, they started putting me on night shifts, which I definitely did not mind since I tended to be a night owl. Also, if you've ever been on closing shift at any retail store, you know you can easily stay an hour or two overtime after the store closes, doing a reshop during the holiday season. It was early December at this time, so I ended up getting off work past 2 a.m. Around this hour, at this time of the year in this part of SoCal, the mist gets unbearably thick, to the point of having to drive 30 miles per hour down the freeway with brights on. Even with that, you still can't even see a foot or two in front of your car. Tonight was one of those nights. I wasn't too bothered by it at that time, but it did set off my anxiety a little bit. By the time I got home, and it took me nearly 20 minutes to find an available space, I was pretty anxious. Of course, with my luck, I had to park at the very back end of the half-mile stretch. Now, it was kind of a tradition of mine to get out of the car, close the door, and meander near my car for a minute or two, while I audibly stretched a bit and sometimes complained about my day to the mist. It was just a little habit thing I did, and tonight was no different. Immediately after I tucked my purse under my arm, I turned on my phone flashlight and stuck it in front of my face to see where I was going. The fog was so thick I could barely even see in front of me. I had walked in this weather many times before, so I knew my way home. A straight shot walk for half a mile, and a sharp left turn at the end of the cemetery. Then crossing the street and onto the gated complex, I was on my merry way until I heard it, a loud, almost obnoxious cough and footsteps behind me. My alert mode set in immediately, and I started walking faster, trying to be quieter about my movements. Call me paranoid, but I've had a fair number of let's not meet moments before, and I certainly was not keen about meeting this stranger walking behind me. Especially given the fact I couldn't see anything around me even with all the light. This continued for a few minutes, with an occasional cough behind me. Then I hear a whistle, the kind cat callers do. This really bewildered me, because 1, you can't see shit, and 2, since you can't see shit in this weather, I assume the person was purposely intimidating me. At this point, I gave up on walking and broke into a full sprint. I could hear the steps behind me break into a run as well. I could hear panting as well. Clearly, this dude was not in the best shape. I mean, neither am I exactly, but at least the run didn't wind me out nearly as bad as him. By now, I was running to the next cemetery. For some godforsaken reason, my panicked mind told me it would be a better idea to duck into the cemetery and hide, instead of just walk straight home. Had there been no fog that night, I would have had a clear view to my grandma's apartment from the area in the cemetery where I stood. I quickly hid, crouching behind the entrance post to the cemetery gates. I knew I had fucked up. His footsteps stopped too, and I could tell he knew I was hiding because of my lack of audible footsteps. I crouched there for what seemed like 10 minutes, too scared to turn on my phone, for fear that he was intently listening out for any sign of me. I had figured out he was standing 5 to 10 feet from where I was at the entrance driveway to the cemetery, just before the gates. This was confirmed when after a few minutes I heard him call out, "I know you're in there, sweetheart." I heard the distinct sound of a lighter being struck, and then smelled cigarette smoke. I figured the dude was now focused on his cigarette. I made a run for it across the cemetery, somehow not tripping over anything, all while intently listening behind me. The cemetery's main entrance has wrought iron fencing, but the back and right end is wooden and serves as a separator between the cemetery and the backyards of various houses. The other side, which is in front of my grandmother's apartment, was chain link. There was no other entrance or exit to the cemetery, but I knew the chain link fence had a flaw and didn't go all the way to the ground. I laid on my stomach, pushed the fence out and up, and wriggled across underneath. I ran directly across the street to my grandma's house, pounding on her door until she opened. I don't know how the dude found me. He must have been standing around nearby as I parked and heard me complain to myself loudly when I got out of the car. But either way, that was one of the most terrifying experiences I ever had. Walking alone at night with headphones on and without my cell phone as a female is probably considered a stupid thing to do, but I've been walking and running at night ever since I was 13 or 14 years old. I was naive at first, probably, and have become even more complacent since then, because I'd never had any bad experiences doing this. I grew up in a small town and was not a morning person. I always enjoyed exercising at night. There's less cars on the road, it's a good way to wind down before bed, and it gives me a lot of space to think about my day. This evening, it was approximately 8:30, and I was out for a walk going up a hill towards a pretty uninhabited part of my route. I live in a newer subdivision that's being developed into a wooded area near a lake, and towards the rural part of town. It's a semi-residential, semi-rural area, if that makes any sense. A lot of houses set far back from the street, and lots of fields in this part of town as well. I noticed the street had been lit up for an unusually long amount of time from behind me. Usually, this particular road was pretty dark. I turned around, only to see a car creeping along at a snail's pace right behind me. Instantly, I got a weird feeling, but I thought maybe this person was just looking for a house address or something, so I kept on walking along my route. The driver and sole occupant of the vehicle, I could see an older guy, maybe in his 40s with glasses on, was now driving right beside me at a steady crawl, about 5 kilometers per hour. I started to panic, but I didn't want to show him that I was freaking out yet. I gave him a confused look, in the hopes I would realize he was just a normal dude lost in a neighborhood he didn't know. Instead, he met my stare with no emotion on his face. That was when I was clued into the fact that yes, bad things can and do happen, and likely that was what was going to happen right now. Immediately, I did a 180 and started walking in the other direction. I looked back to see he had pulled into a driveway. I was very relieved. I thought the man had reached his destination, and I was perhaps being paranoid all along. Then, though, the sickening feeling came back to my stomach when I saw him back out of the driveway and continue to follow directly alongside me. My adrenaline kicked in right then. My subconscious told me, murder, not tonight. I booked it at lightning speed to a side street that connected the street I was on to the street I lived on. I jumped onto the first lawn I saw and dove into a hedge. I removed my high-vis vest I wore for night runs and shoved it underneath my black hoodie. I watched him through the leaves as he drove up and down the street several times looking in my direction. I was hyperventilating now, debating on what I should do. I thought about knocking on this person's door whose bush I was hiding in, but the urge to just get the hell away was too strong. I waited until I hadn't seen him drive by for at least 15 minutes. Then I decided I had enough adrenaline to run all the way home. It was only about a 7-minute walk away, and I could make it in 3 if I ran. Instead of walking on the sidewalk, though, I ran through people's lawns just in case I saw him again. Perhaps I could sprint to a neighbor's door for help in an emergency. I had never run so fast in my life. I was hyperventilating when I got home. These weird, loud, short, gasping breaths from fear. I'm a runner, so the run itself wouldn't have affected me in that way. I was bright red and shaking, and I called my mom immediately. 4 hours later, I'm sharing this for myself to work out what happened. Perhaps it was some misunderstanding and he was harmless, but I'm on high alert right now, and I can't sleep at all. This story fucked me up for a while, and I'm still not completely okay, though it is easier to cope nowadays. It was the middle of summer, and my parents had left for the weekend to go to our house in the Cape Cod. It's about a 2-hour drive away, so it's no big deal for them to leave me alone for just a few days. My mom had made some pulled pork and pasta for me to heat up whenever, and I had some money if I wanted to order a pizza as well. Things were pretty much all good. The first night I was alone, I stayed up till 3 in the morning, playing Xbox, so I woke up really late the next day. I checked my phone when I woke up and saw it was a little bit past 1. I had made some plans to play some street hockey with my friends at around 3, so I threw myself out of bed and stumbled into the shower. I take some really long showers, so when my parents are gone, I go mental. I was in there for about 45 minutes on my phone, scrolling through Reddit and Twitter and whatnot, when I heard my front door open. My bathroom is directly up the stairs from the back door, and the thing is pretty loud when it opens and closes. I immediately froze, since it was obvious I was supposed to be alone. I waited for about 2 minutes, ears trained and trying to hear anything else. I couldn't hear anything though. I figured maybe it was just the wind, or maybe my parents had come home early because they'd forgotten something. I turned off the shower, wrapped my towel around myself, and slowly walked down the stairs to check things out. So, the stairs to the kitchen where the back door is are pretty tight and walled in. I couldn't see the kitchen when I walked down because of this. Even though my house was old as shit and each step on the stairs made a super loud creak, I took my time and tried to be as quiet as possible. It took me 45 seconds to walk down all 12 stairs. When I got to the second to last one, right before I could see around the corner into the kitchen, I took a little breath to compose myself. In my mind, I knew I was being stupid. Obviously, there was not going to be anything in the kitchen. There's no way I wouldn't have heard another noise. Besides, there was no reason for anyone to still be there. even if there had been burglars or something before. After sort of mentally chastising myself for being such a wuss, I chuckled to myself for being so stupid and normally walked the last 2 stairs down. I turned the corner into the kitchen. Standing about 2 feet away from me, right in the center, was a man staring right at me, perfectly still, with a massive smile across his face. He just stood there staring at me. The thing I remember most vividly wasn't his face or his smile though, but his arms. They weren't just at his side. Instead, he held them in the strangest, most abnormal position I've ever seen. It was like where one might normally hold their arms, but he had rotated them to the point where they were almost completely reversed, as well as lifting them a little behind himself. I don't know why I remember this so much. It just looked like a demonic possession or something, I guess. Honest to God, I think I almost had a heart attack right then and there. Looking back, I think I can realize how creepy this situation was. In the moment, though, I was so startled I took a step towards him and punched him as hard as I could right in the center of his jaw, sort of half slapping and pushing him towards the ground. The very second I connected, I sprinted up the stairs, dropping my towel in the kitchen with my heart beating out of control. I sprinted into my room and locked the door behind me. I quickly put a chair up against the doorknob like you see in TV, and almost without thinking, I immediately called 911. Nearly in tears, I told the operator everything. As I sat on the floor of my room, practically in the fetal position, staring at my door, praying a cop would be there soon, I noticed that the light coming from the gap between my door and the floor had stopped. The fucker was standing right outside. There's no words to describe the feeling I had in that moment. I was paralyzed with fear, watching the shadow across the bottom of the door shift in tiny ways. I stayed balled up, staring at the gap, praying the man would just go away for what seemed like an hour. All the while, the 911 operator was asking, "Hello, sir? Sir, are you there? Hello?" I didn't want to make a single noise. Even if I wanted to move my arms and bring the phone to my mouth, I don't think I could have. Eventually, the light returned to the gap, and I heard the faintest of footsteps, slowly creaking the wooden floorboards as he walked down the hall. It was silent for minutes as I just sat there curled up, unable to even speak. I heard banging on the front door and the sound of 2 officers entering my house. Finally, I felt safe. I opened the door to see the 2 of them standing there, and I almost cried. Nowadays, my parents won't leave me home anymore, thank God, and I check every lock on the house before going to bed. I still get nightmares occasionally, and my heart starts racing whenever I see someone standing still. For the most part, though, I'm doing alright. Even working with sketch artists and a few lineups as well, the police never found whoever the fuck was in my house. That sends shivers down my spine every time I look outside. I half expect to just see him standing across the street smiling under a lamppost or something. I have no idea what he wanted that day, or who he was.